Hello, students. Welcome to week 6 for the course of conflict resolution and negotiation processes. In this session, we will talk about the model 7 out of 9 models presented in your book, in your textbook, this conflict resolution toolbox. It's a different model. The boundary model is a different model. Mm, a little more philosophical mind we can find in this model, and also some more applicable approaches to conflict resolution in this model. So let's go to the first part of this model, and you should know about the founder of this model. The founder of this model was Larry Provost, a PhD student that in his doctoral dissertation looked at the nature of conflict and crisis and suggested an underlying framework to understand what drove it. It's a basic questions. As you know, it's a basic questions that what type of approaches you are working with. It's not only about the models, it is about the approaches. As you remember, we talked about two types of approaches to looking at, to approach to models of conflict resolution. Some of them talk about the underlying causes, root causes of conflicts, and some of them talking about the procedures or the tools or the methods you can use for resolving, for disputing the conflict and the disagreements. So in this model, it is very short model, very short model about the uh, elements, components, but very realistic, very realistic. You can find it in all levels of your life. How to use this model to resolving, to disputing about the conflicts, about the disagreements in your life. The boundary model is a creative and unique way of looking at conflict that attempts to frame it through a single specific lens, not about other lens, not about the other methods to resolve the conflicts. So like other models, at the first step, we want to talk about the diagnosis of the conflict. The boundary model suggests that common elements that all things, people, and organisms share is boundaries. Boundaries is very important. Boundaries is vital, is crucial, is fundamental, is radical in all the organisms. In all the organisms, the basic component you can find it is which is the ending point and which is the starting point and which is the ending point. These are the boundaries of that model. These are the boundaries of that organism. If it is a stone, if it's a monkey, it's a Homo sapiens, or no, everything. For example, for the rivers, the basic part for defining where is the ending part of river are the boundaries, which is left side, which is right side. The boundaries of river, the boundaries of your home, the boundaries of your land, the boundaries of your family, the boundaries of your character, the boundaries of your talent. So as model says, the boundary model suggests that common elements that all things, people, and organisms share is boundaries. Boundaries operate on many levels. Level one, on a physical level, everything has a physical boundary and physical limits. My body, your car, your ball, galaxy, earth, country, home, everything, every physical things, all physical things have boundaries. Without boundaries, we cannot define it. We cannot say, yes, this is not my car, this is my car. This is not my home, this is my home. All physical things have boundaries. Two, on a behavioral level, all activity is subject to boundaries of many kinds. Boundary of many kinds. For example, you say that it's my privacy, it's personal for me, it's for our race, it is for our culture, it is for our nation, it is for our situational position, for example, in our organization. If you are a mid-level manager, you have a boundaries of authorities and duties. If you are general manager, if you are simple worker, different situations, different positions are defined by your responsibility duties, which are the basic components of, for example, organizational boundaries. And on a behavioral level, boundaries take the form of laws, agreements, contracts, rules, procedures, convention, orders, decisions, and so on. And so on. It is about the behavioral level. Again, you can see it in the very, very part of, for example, uh, social level, behavioral level, social behavioral level. For example, when you are talking about legislation, about rules, about ethics, even when you are talking about ethics, you are talking about the boundaries, which is good, which is bad, which is evil, which is better, which is humanistic, which is not humanistic. So you should consider you should consider the boundaries for social level. So in different level, if you want to define something clearly at the basic part, at the basic stage, you should consider what the boundaries you can find for this or that. And what are the key elements of boundaries? We can find four key elements for boundaries. One, define standards for behavior. Two, jurisdiction or legitimacy. Three, authority or enforcement. And four, norms. These are very important to define the boundaries for all types of boundaries. You should know what are the standards of behavior for that boundary, what are the legitimacy or jurisdiction for that boundary, what is the authority or enforcement or the force needed to keep that boundary, and what are the norms of that boundary. We will talk about it. Define standards for behavior. At first, you should know the meaning of a standard. What is a standard? For everything you can consider, a standard is the minimum level of acceptance. Under the standard level, it is not acceptable. So, a standard doesn't talk about the desired idealistic quality. Standards talk about the acceptable minimal quality. We have two levels. One, acceptable level. Two, expected level. For example, if the grading of the course is between 0 and 20, the acceptable level is 10. If you are grading 10, yes, you are not failed. But the expected level is 20. The highest level, the best level, the A plus is 20. So when you want to define something and look at the standards, at first step, you should know about the defined standards for behavior. It is the expected level and the expected level and uh, acceptable level. So now we are talking about the boundaries. What are the defined standards for behavior as a boundary? Boundaries must have defined standard for maximum and or minimum allowable behavior. In this, in one side is the maximum, in other side is the minimum. Between these two extremes, we can call it boundary. These are the boundary: maximum level, minimum level. maximum acceptable level, minimum acceptable level, maximum expected level, minimum acceptable level. It is allowed. And between these two levels, two extremes, you can find the square, you can find the area which is allowed to perform, to have behavior, to have social levels, to have physiological level and other things. So boundaries must have defined standards for maximum and or minimum allowable behavior. These standards are a form of limits that the boundary establishes. When you are talking about the standards, you are talking about the allowed boundary, allowed limit. You are talking about limits. For example, please pay attention to this example because during the next slide, we will analyze this very simple example. For example, on our highways, the speed limit typically defines a maximum speed of 70 miles per hour and the minimum speed typically in the 4 or 5 miles per hour range between 40 to 70. Minimum allow level for a speed in highway is 40 miles per hour, and the maximum level is 70 miles per hour. Okay. If you exceed the limit in either direction, you are subject to a fine, lower than 40 or more than 70. You are subject to give a fine, give a ticket. Okay, so at first is define the standards for behavior. For example, driving in a highway, the minimum level, the maximum level. Minimum level of 40, maximum level of 70. Between them, we can find the allowable, the acceptable, the authorized area. For example, if your area is about your driving speed, you can find it in between 40 miles per hour to 70 miles per hour. And jurisdiction or legitimacy. Boundaries must have jurisdiction, which is a source of legitimacy for existing at all. Jurisdictions are is a source of legitimacy for existing at all. In our highway example, for example, that legitimacy comes from the legislation passed by the state. In California, 65 miles per hour is the speed limit. Or from one of the many related laws that a government has jurisdiction to enact to control the roads and highways. It's a very little difference between jurisdiction or legitimacy. Sometimes legitimacy, sometimes not always. Sometimes legitimacy is related to your conventions, to your society, to your minority. Sometimes it is not. But totally it is related to legislation, to law. So the second element of boundaries is about jurisdiction or legitimacy. The third one, it is very important. Why do we have police, legal enforcement, law enforcement? Why? You can train other people to do what is right and what is wrong. You can train them. What is the necessity of having an enforcement, for example, like police? Because of authority. The third part, the third element of boundaries is authority or enforcement. Boundaries must have some form of authority. Authority in this case is an entity, process, person, or group responsible for enforcing the boundary. They are the enforcing group of boundary. Without authority, which is not a subjective concept, it is an objective, operational, not concept, of operational object. We can find them in reality. It is not about your inner police or inner court or judgment or conscience. No, it is about the legal, law, fine, and have the boundaries. In this case is an entity, process, person, group, a group responsible for enforcing the authority. Without any process or person enforcing it, a boundary effectively doesn't exist. Effectively, it can be exist, yes, but not effective. Nobody can go, for example, on the same line that we talk about from the boundaries in a highway. In the highway example, the police have the authority to enforce speed limits. And the final part, the final element, the fourth element of boundaries is norms. We will talk about the differences between the standard and the norm and the extremes in the next slides. Boundaries usually, though not always, have a certain degree of tolerance. It is not a very, very rigid line before this line and after that line. We are talking about boundary. We are not talking about borders. Borders are from the line. We call it border line. But we are talking about boundary, a limitation with a minimum and maximum level of tolerance. Boundary, usually through not always, have a certain degree of tolerance, latitude, or variance, which are called norms. Norms of the are the variances, are the latitude or tolerances we can consider for the boundaries. Norms are the reasonable latitudes around a boundary that we accept without perceiving the boundary to have been violated. No violation. In our highway example, if you ask the average driver how fast you could go on the highway without risking a ticket, the minimum you are likely to hear is 80 miles per hour. What we talk about the standard of 70 miles per hour. But you can hear from the drivers that yes, until the 80 miles per hour, we don't have any caution for example, receiving the ticket. This means that although the boundary is 70 miles per hour, the norm is actually 18 miles per hour. You can see here again, before going to the other parts, acceptable minimum behavior, acceptable maximum behavior, norm until 50 to 40 is norm, and from 70 to 80 is also norm. So the limits are Authority, Highway Police, and Jurisdiction Highway Traffic Act. Here you can hear. Now, here, this part. Our authority in this example is Highway Police, and our jurisdiction is Highway Traffic Act. The source of authority is jurisdiction, not the same enforcement. Enforcement is our police, is our authority. And you can see between 50 miles per hour to 70 miles per hour. Under 50 on to 7 to 40, it is norms. Over 70 to 80, it is norms. So between 40 to 80, there is no risk for receiving your ticket for as a fine. After that and before that and after that, there is a high risk to receiving your ticket. And in the continuous with the boundary model, we want to know about the two parts. One, boundary model conflict and boundary model crisis. When we are encountering a conflict based on the boundary model, you see here again in the example of highway, conflict is caused when a boundary is challenged, threatened, or circumvented. Challenged, threatened, or circumvented. Conflict requires an intervention in order to resolve it. You cannot say that no problem, don't think about your conflict without no necessary intervention for resolving the conflict. your conflict will get more complicated, more conflictual. So passing the time is not a matter of resolving the conflict. You cannot say only, yes, time will resolve everything. No, basically time, the matter of time, the beauty of time is destroying the the major nature of the time is damaging everything, destroying everything. Also in physics, there's a principle in physics by the title of entropy principle of entropy. Entropy says that every systematic, complicated structure wants to go to destruct. Why? Because destruction needs less energy in comparison to complicated or constructed or fixed or permanent structures. And survival needs less energy, not more energy. It is something like metabolism. In mysticism and yoga, they said that you have specific amount of breathing for whole of your life. If you breathe slower and deeper, the time of your life will be longer and longer and longer. Also, it's an analogy. I know it, but it's something like conflict. If you don't do anything about your conflict not will be the same, will be more conflictual. If the norm, for example, expands to 85 miles per hour, and the party with authority for this boundary fails to intervene, it starts threatening the very exercise of the boundary. The first person, the second person, the third one, the fourth one, the fifth one. After, for example, 1 year, you see that nobody is driving at the maximum speed of 7 or, yes, with the norms of 80 miles per hour. Everybody is driving at the speed of 85. The norms are threatened. Because of that, using enforcements, using authority for the norms are very, very important, especially when we have some conflictual situation in boundary mode. Another concept is crisis, something worse than conflict. For example, you see here, a crisis is an escalation of a conflict. It is limitation, okay, boundaries, allowable after boundaries or before boundaries is norm. More than norms at the first stage is conflict. Escalated conflict is crisis. So we have authorized speed, we have normal speed, conflictual speed, and crisis speed. A crisis is an escalation of a conflict for all aspects of your life. Okay, when we are talking about the norms, you are talking about the tolerance, about the speed more than the boundaries. Yes, but we can consider many levels of tolerance for those area between the boundaries and the maximum level of norms. But when norms are threatened, we are entering to conflictual situation. When conflicts are escalated, we are entering to crisis. When a boundary is threatened, violated, or circumvented, and this situation is allowed to continue without intervention. If you don't intervene over your conflict will become your crisis. Because of that, intervention is so important. if you don't have any intervention on your conflicts, okay, you have some alarms for going out of the boundaries. Say you are on the norm, but um, have a precaution about, for example, your speed, about your behavior. It is norm, but it is not on the boundaries, out of boundaries, but it is in the area of tolerance. After that, you see, oh, somebody is breaking your norms, your legal norms, your social norms, behavioral norms, ethical norms, personal norms, family norms. Everything has boundaries. Tolerable boundaries are norms. Threatened norms are called conflict. Escalated conflicts are called crisis. This is a linear procedure from the area, authorized area, between the boundaries to the next spot without intervention. It results in the boundary collapsing altogether, collapsing altogether, as you can see here. When this happens, it causes a crisis. For example, if 85 miles per hour routinely goes unpunished, there is effectively no speed limit left on the roads, resulting in the norm continuing to expand at will. It is not about legal, it is not about legislation, it is not about police, it is not about law enforcement. It is about at will. Everybody wants to determine his or her norms, his or her limitation, his or her boundaries. We talk about the necessity of boundaries. Why we are talking about this model in the context of conflict resolution? Because at first you see that in one part you are entering to the area, conflictual area. Second part, in many interpersonal, organizational, and corporation problems, you see that people doesn't have any agreement on the norms, not on the boundaries, on the norms with the tolerance, but different people wants to have different tolerance area, not the boundary, tolerance area out of the boundaries. But they say, is it okay also? Also, is it okay? Also, is it okay? So it is not okay. You are entering to the conflictual area. It is not okay. And if you don't do anything for your for the resolution of your conflict, you are entered to the critical area or crisis area. So it is out of management. It is at will. There is no such thing, so-called at will, when you are talking about legislation. Also, you have an authorized limitation, authorized area. Also, in one part, it is tolerable. Okay, after that, it is not tolerable. It is legal. It is law. It is legislation. It has punishment. It has fine. Okay, and when this happens, it causes a crisis. If 85 miles per hour routinely goes unpunished, there's effectively no speed limit left on the roads, resulting in a norm continuing to expand at will. In the end, there will be a significant increase in accidents and deaths. Finally, you say, what's the problem with the overexpanded norms? In overexpanded norms, for example, in highway example, in overly expanded norms, there is no law for controlling driving. With these very rigid legislation for driving, especially in America, with these rigid legislation for driving, you can find many high risk driving, drunk drivers, bad drivers, high risk drivers, drivers under influence of medication and drugs and other things. With these rigid, very specific, very clear, very rigid legislation, laws, punishment, fines for driving, you consider the situation that you are over expanded from the norms and entering the conflictual area. And after that, entering the crisis area. Specific reasons for conflicts. In the boundary model, we have four specific reasons for conflicts. Number one, the boundary model states that most conflict is caused by four specific areas. Reasons directly related to how people interact with the boundaries they face. Number one, lack of clarity around what boundary is. Number two, lack of acceptance of who has authority to enforce a boundary, who is responsible, who is the force, who is the responsible for enforcing the boundaries. Number three, lack of acceptance of who has jurisdiction over a boundary. Jurisdiction is the source of boundary, source of limitation, source of legitimation. And number four, deliberate expansion of a boundary past acceptable norms. We are talking about it in the previous slides. Overexpanded norms. And it is deliberately, it's your at will, not only, for example, by some legals. Yes, let me talk about different states of America. In California, a speed limit for driving, the speed limit is 65 in the highways. But you go to 70 miles per hour or 75 sometimes, or 70 is, yes, norms. There is no enforcement for 70 miles per hour. It is norm, not boundary. Boundary is 65. But between 65 to 70 miles per hour, it is norm. It is not legal, but it is under tolerance by the police and enforcement. In some other states, it is about 75. So we can consider between 75 to 80 or between 75 to 82 or 83 is norm. And finally, in other states, it is about 80 miles per hour. It is not at will. Some states, by legislation, describe the limitation of the speed in different numbers. But it is specific numbers. No, go slowly, drive smoothly. No, no, no. We are talking about the numbers, not your will, not your diagnosis, which is good for me, which is not good for me. You are not eligible to know about the legislation. Its legislation is the matter of court, is the matter of police, is matter of law, matter of matters, legal options. And it should be go to the court and, for example, have some pay some punishment or fines. What area is at will? The normal area between the minimum level or maximum level of boundaries and tolerable area. It is called norm. According to the model, the most common causes of conflict are lack of clarity about boundaries and norms, or a deliberate pushing of envelope to expand the norms as far as possible. Reason one and reason four. Researches that has been conducted based on this model, the boundaries model, says that the most popular, the most current, the most usual reasons are number one and number four. Lack of clarity around what the boundary is. This is number one. And number four, deliberate expansion of a boundary past acceptable norms. Deliberate, at will, personal, by your taste, by your will. Number two and number three, it is important, but it's not so frequent in the society. You can find them. Why? Because it is not acceptance. It is not a matter of acceptance. You are not in the state of saying, yes, I accept the legal parts, or no, I don't accept. Also, it is the freedom of speech, but it is not a matter of speech. It is a matter of government. It is human nature to push boundaries and expand norms. Everybody wants to expand his or her area. It is not called area. It is not about the humans. It is about the mammals. Mammals want to expand their living area, which is called territory. Mammals want to expand their territories. You can find it in lions, in tigers, in leopards, in sheep, in cows, specifically in mammals with in the wild animals, also in homos and especially in Homo sapiens or human beings. We want to expand our territory. Why? It is a natural. Because of that, we fight together. Why we kill each other? Many killing, many murdering, many, for example, you say homicide, genocide, filicide, and sometimes even suicide is related to expanding your territory because you want to have more kingdom of mind, kingdom of sex, kingdom of economy, kingdom of power. It is not important that what is your matter of kingdom. It is your choice. It is important that kingdom to be a king as a symbolic also we are talking, not a real king. As a symbolic word, we want to be the king of our territory. More territory, more expanded territory, more powerful kingdom. Although children are constantly testing the boundaries we set, adolescents and children, often to find out what will happen if they either expand them or violate them. Everybody is testing it. Although it may appear that this tendency to push the envelope is the cause of much conflict, the real cause is that people with jurisdiction and authority often overlook the expanded norms. Overlook. It's this lack of intervention that sustains and escalates conflicts and bring it and transit from conflictual situation to critical situation, from nature of conflict to the nature of crisis. And for the purpose of our case study, we will diagnose three boundary issues that appear to be a source of conflict between Sally, Bob, and Diane. We are talking about our case study. It is a short, very, very short uh, session because we should talk with each other about the major problems. And if I want to have only monologue and only present, it is very short. For the purpose of our case study, we will diagnose three boundary issues that appear to be a source of conflict between three persons, Sally, Bob, and Diane. To start with, there are two board boundaries that exist in almost all workplaces. One, management's right to make operational decisions that employees must abide by. It is the managerial authority. Two, workers' right to a safe workplace free of harassment and discrimination. We have two areas of boundaries. Boundaries, an area of territory, of power, of responsibility, of duties of managerial part, and also one part is related to the employees, to the co-workers, to the workers. One about the operational decisions, you should obey them. Why? Because I am manager, you are my co-worker, you are my employee. I should respond because of my decisions. You should not respond. I am the manager. I have the knowledge, I have the experience, I have the authority, I have the force to make decisions. You are not responsible. I should be accountable and responsible for my decisions as a manager in an organization. And on the other parts, you say, yes, I am a worker here. I work here. I'm your employee, your organization. But I have my clear and sometimes not completely clear rights as a worker. I'm a worker. So For example, sexual harassment, gender-based or race-based or religion-based discrimination, legally is not allowed, but you can find in every organization gender harassment, sexual harassment, gender-based discrimination, race-based discrimination. When you in a country, when you have Black Lives Matter or BLM, what does it mean? It means that still in the flag of freedom all around the world, we can find many direct discrimination. Direct discrimination. It is not only about the fault of a police. We are talking about a culture against or for, with or for Black people or women's or LGBTQ, even in a very, very free state, something like California, with the legal legislation for same-sex marriage. But you go to the street and see some of, not always, it's very good, but some of the behaviors, you see that, sorry, where are you from? How do you think about the same-sex marriage? You see some very radical opposition against, for example, same-sex marriage or Black Lives Matter or Black people or skin colors. Now we had some protests and some fighting, street fighting for Asian people in the other side of America. Because of that, in an organization, you should know two types of rights: managerial types and employee types. Managerial types of decision making, and workers types of rights for harassment, for discrimination, for wages, for the law and other things. In our case study, we talk about Sally, Bob, and Diane. Areas of boundary conflict. The first conflict is areas of boundary conflict. Three areas of boundary conflicts in the case study are: one, the start and finish times of the job; deliberate expansion of norms. When an organization said you are free whenever you want to come, for example, if you work in Uber, it is deliberate time scheduling. There is no scheduling. There are some good offers, yes, but there is no time. Every time you want, you can turn on your Uber app, and every time you want, you can turn off your Uber app again. There is no fixed schedule, weekly, daily, monthly, yearly scheduled time for coming. But Uber is a private working, it's a personal working. It is not about an organization. The same base, yes, it's an organization. But as a driver, when you are working Uber as a driver, it's your time. Some people love it, say, yes, it's good. Every time I am not in a good mood, for example, going out to have a circle around, I said, yes, some passengers. But in an organization, there is no completely at-field time schedule. Two, legitimate chain of command followed, challenging the jurisdiction and authority. And three, respectful behavior in the workplace, lack of clarity of the boundary around respect, or deliberately expanding the norms. We have these areas of boundary conflict in our case study. Number one, the start and finish times of the job, deliberate expansion of the norms. Clearly, the established start time boundary is 9 a.m., and Bob is violating this boundary. He states that others do this as well, implying that he's behaving within the norm. When you say, yes, other people are doing like me, you are talking about the norms. It is not legal, but it is tolerable part. It is tolerable area of tolerance. Because if everybody is doing something and nobody receive any punishment, any fine, it is not legal, it is not good, but it is norm. So Bob is trying to say other people, yes, we want to expand our norms, not our boundaries. He states others do this as well, implying that he's behaving within the norm, a view not shared by Sally. For Sally, the norm is that staff can be 10 to 20 minutes late few times per year, whereas Bob feels that the norm allows him to be late on a weekly basis. Number two, legitimate chain of command followed, challenging the jurisdiction and authority. In this case, Sally has established a new requirement or boundary that Bob take direction from Diane. Bob appears to be refusing to accept this decision and is thereby violating this boundary. A refusal to follow direction from the person you report to is often referred to as insubordination. What Bob is doing is called insubordination. Bob, however, does not view Sally's judgment or decision as a legitimation. Let me put it here. Bob, however, does not view Sally's judgment or decision as legitimate and therefore is challenging both her jurisdiction and authority in the situation. After being threatened with discipline, Bob adopts a work to rule approach, a strategy that tactically acknowledges Sally's authority. Bob wouldn't have changed anything if he felt Sally had no authority at all. It is the price of authority. It is the importance of authority. The price of have discipline for creating, maintaining not very fixed and rigid boundaries, but very allowable boundaries. Okay. After being threatened with discipline, Bob drops a work to rule approach, a strategy that tactically acknowledges Sally's authority, while at the same time refutes Sally's jurisdiction or right to require him to take direction from Diana. Also, you can check the major story of the case study in the first chapter of your book. Two, respectful behavior in the workplace, lack of clarity of the boundary around respect, or deliberately expanding the norms. This boundary issue relates to the way Diane speaks to Bob. Bob believes that Diane is violating a boundary that requires respect in the workplace. Most workplaces have boundary around respectful behavior. It is not important that you are a manager or you are a co-worker or you are a simple worker or employee. Written and unwritten, legal and illegal, conventional or post-conventional or unconventional, all the communities, all the families, all the societies, all the organizations have many rules, many conventions about the respectful behavior. And in legal part, it is very important. You can, for example, file a lawsuit for their unrespectful behavior with you. So, around it, though few are clearly articulated, it is the problem. I saw because of that, I said that it is written and unwritten, formal and informal, not conventional and unconventional. But conventional, sometimes it is post-conventional. Post-conventional is mean it is accepted by many people, not clearly dictated to personnel, to co-workers, to employees that this behavior is unrespectful, this behavior is respectful. It is totally acceptable. It is called socially acceptable norms. It's not about that organization. It is about your community, your society, something greater and more important than your organization. Bob feels that Diane is violating this boundary. Diane clearly doesn't feel she's being all that disrespectful, especially given how she feels Bob is behaving. Uh, when we want to talk about the respectful behavior between people, three or four things you should consider. One, level of intimacy. It is very important. Intimacy, not relationship, not relativeness. For example, level of intimacy between a boy and his girlfriend is higher than level of intimacy between a boy and his or her his father or mother. It is not about respect. It is about intimacy. Intimacy is mean that you have the power, the capacity to say the last secrets of your life. There is a boundary between the parents and the children. It is not legal boundary. It is ethical boundary. It is uh, culture-based boundaries. It is social boundaries, social-based boundaries, race-based boundaries. So you are so intimate with your girlfriend, with your boyfriend, not at the same level, for example, with your father or your mother. It is not good. It is not bad. That type of intimacy is not a matter of parenting. It's a matter of friendship, sexual friendship, intimate relationship, and friendship. Also, same-sex relationship. It is not only about the sex. It is about the intimate relationship. Normally, it is with the heterosexual. For for example, if you are a boy with your girlfriend, if you are a girl with your boyfriend. So pay attention. The second one is the level of power. In higher levels of power, authority, many people don't consider their behavior as an irrespectful behavior. They say, yes, I'm a manager, I'm a king, I'm a boss, I'm a leader. I am legitimated for having such a behavior. But subordinate says, yes, you are manager, you are leader, you are boss, but you are not legitimated for having any type of behavior you want to have with us. So, level of intimacy, level of power. The third part, the third component is level of needs. In which level of needs we are behaving to each other. It is not about the power, it is about the need. You may be a co-worker at the same level, but you need each other to work with each other, for example, to finalize a project. It is not about intimacy, so only very, very normal co-worker. It is not about the power, nobody is subordinate, nobody is manager. It is level of corporation, level of need, for example, in an organization. So after intimacy, after power, after need, the final part is the level of cross-cultural conflict, in which level we don't understand each other. For example, some behaviors in Latin America is a respectful, or it is not very, very unrespectful, but in America and in Europe it is unrespectful, or vice versa in America, in contrast with, for example, Middle East. Some behaviors, some eating behaviors, some going to party behaviors, or some social behaviors, helping each other, or um, it is called, I forgot the word for looking at humanity, permission people to be human, or some feeling of yes, everybody can do anything he or she wants, even in the case of he or she accept the responsibility and accountability of behavior. Because of these items, you should consider that to be respectful or unrespectful, to behave respectful, to act respectful or unrespectful is not a matter of always legislation. Respect is not legitimized by legal forces, by legislation. It is more culture based, family based, training based. In all three situated described, the parties are solidly in conflict, meaning that the boundaries between the parties appear to have been violated, and or the jurisdiction authority of the boundary is being challenged. Unless an intervention takes place, it will quickly develop into a crisis and begin spreading to other employees in the area. As we can see, diagnosing the situation through the boundary model often yields functional and practical results rather than psychological or theoretical ones. Let's look now at what boundary model can suggest in terms of intervention that may help. We are coming to a strategic directions. Strategically, the boundary model suggests that when a conflict or crisis occur, strategically, the boundary model suggests that when a conflict or crisis occurs, there must be an intervention. This intervention must have as its primary goal the reestablishment of all four elements of boundary. Number one, boundary clarified and reestablished. We are talking about the causes of conflict based on this model. One of them is not to be clear. The strategy is boundary clarified and reestablished. Two, jurisdiction clarified and reestablished. Three, authority clarified and reestablished. And four, norms allowed. Number one, strategic direction, boundary clarified and reestablished. The first step must be reestablished, the boundary itself, not the norms. At first, we should talk about the boundary itself, not the norms. Norms are other stage. After clarification of boundaries, we can talk about the tolerable area, so-called norms. Norms are defined as the reasonable or accepted latitude to the boundary and have no formal existence in and of themselves. For example, if you receive a speeding ticket for going 90 miles per hour in a 70 miles per hour zone, the ticket is for 2 miles per hour over the speed limit. The court does not say, because traveling at 8 miles per hour is the norm, you were really speeding by only 10 miles per hour. The boundary itself is what legitimacy, and that is what must be reestablished. If you are overexpanding your norms, you will destroy the value of norms. You cannot use the norms if you are overexpanding the norms. If you are using the norms, no problem. Expanding the boundary is called norms. Expanding the norms is called conflict. Expanding the conflict is called crisis. But it is in the forward line, foregoing, not back. Yes, if you are in the normal area, perfect. If you are overextending the norms, you cannot use the norm as a basic, for example, for court. You say, no, everybody goes until the 18 miles per hour, 80 miles per hour, and I have gone only 10 miles per hour. The court said, no. The boundary is 70 miles per hour. The norm is until 8 miles per hour. The norm is expanding the boundaries. This is not legal, but it is tolerable. But if you are overexpanding the boundaries, overexpanding the norms, you miss the value of norms. For example, for the court and for punishment and for fine. So boundary clarified and reestablished. Two, jurisdiction clarified and reestablished. The source of legitimacy. The jurisdiction must be established and accepted by all parties. Until all parties accept the legitimacy of whoever established the rules will not be respected. If you don't accept the power, the source of legitimacy, for example, in a family, someone is the source of power, someone is a source of legitimacy. If you don't accept his or her, maybe the mother, maybe father, one of the parents, maybe grandpa, maybe grandma, if you don't accept the legitimacy, the jurisdiction, the source of legitimacy as a power supply, as a source of power, source of legitimacy, Okay, the rules are not accepted. The boundaries are not accepted. Whatever you want to say, it's not important. Nobody have a good, respectful, and legal based on boundary behaviors with you. The third one is authority clarified and reestablished. So, in the second part, we talk about jurisdiction. Now we are talking about authority. The authority must be established and accepted by all parties. Until all parties accept the authority of whoever is monitoring and maintaining the rules, those rules will not be respected. And the final part, it is norms allowed by the legislation part, by the organizer part, and by the people who want to work or who want to have, for example, in this example of highway, to, for example, drive between the 70 miles per hour and 80 miles per hour. Finally, as an optional step, and only after the preceding three steps have been taken, some reasonable latitude from the boundary may be allowed. It is an optional step because a zero tolerance policy, when you are talking about zero tolerance policy, it means that you don't consider any norms, only the boundaries. After boundaries, there is a fine and punishment, only the boundaries. You know, many companies, many organizations, not for customers, for co-worker, for employees, they said we have zero tolerance policy. We don't accept any mistake for our customers. Customers are always right. Because of that, because a zero tolerance policy may also be appropriate, which simply means that the norm becomes identical to the boundary. It is good. Say, when you are talking about the norms, what the boundary you are for determining. If you are determining a norm against the boundaries, why you are determining the boundaries? If it is legal to drive at the maximum speed limit of 70 miles per hour, when you say until 80 miles per hour is it's good, it's tolerable. You say the boundary is 80 miles per hour without any tolerance. It has zero tolerance policy. Should certain norms be allowed, they must be monitored closely as there is a strong human tendency to continually expand the norms whenever possible. It is not so kind, I know. Zero tolerance policy is not so kind, but it is humanistic. When we are talking about humanistic approach to human being, we are not always talking about empathetical part or a very kind part, very compassionate approach to human beings. We are talking about the nature of human. There's a very, very good book. I will I will upload it, the book in your Moodle. So called, it is by Philip Zimbardo, author is Philip Zimbardo, Lucifer Effect. Lucifer Effect is the basic scientific research about why good people act so badly. Lucifer Effect. Why good people act so evil, so bad, so wild. It's one part of human nature. Who has taught that all my human nature is from, for example, God? I should be always kind. I prefer to be always kind. I prefer to be always patient. I prefer to be always, for example, polite. But real story of real life is not something like that. And consider that other people are also human. If we cannot perceive them, understand them, is our problem, not their problem. So when you say zero tolerance policy, you say, okay, it is the boundary. Going out of boundary has a punishment, has a fine. Why? Because if you say, yes, it is boundary, and after that, it is red light, and it is yellow light, and orange light, and it is green light, and you can go until the red light is turning on. You see, in these very daily simple aspect to life, to driving, we can find many, many things not tolerable. car accidents, car crashes, only because that they say, yes, I want to expand the norms at will on my way. Because of that, I think sometimes, especially in the hazardous and dangerous and vital killer situations like driving, for example, we can consider zero tolerance policy because human nature wants to overexpand, not only expand, to overexpand the norms. And when you're overexpanding your norms, it is your norms, not the social norms, not the allowed norms, not the acceptable norms, no, not the legal norms. It is your personal own norms, and you are not only by yourself. You are a social being. You are acting and reacting with each other and other people. You see here a simple guide for a strategic direction, diagnosis, violation of a boundary due to the lack of clarity or differing expectations. A strategic intervention is clarify the boundary, discuss the expectations of all parties, clarify the consequences of boundary violation. And second one, the diagnosis is violation of the boundary due to the deliberate expansion of its norm, and you say reestablish and clarify the boundary as a strategic intervention, and lack of acceptance of jurisdiction as the diagnosis is gain acceptance of the jurisdiction, reestablish legitimacy for jurisdiction, bring in higher authority to clarify and to define jurisdiction if needed, negotiate new jurisdiction if appropriate. The last part, the last element is very important. When you want to talk about the new jurisdiction, if needed, it can change all the game. It can be a game changer step. Also, you see that in the book and the real life says that if needed. And the final and the last diagnosis in this model for conflict resolution is lack of acceptance of authority, gain acceptance of who has authority, establish legitimacy for authority, bring in higher authority to clarify and to define authority issue if needed, and finally enforce boundary if necessary, negotiate new levels of authority if appropriate. It's a very very short glance at the strategic direction that we can use for our for problem. But in our case study, what are our strategic directions? In a case study, the strategies to intervene can be applied to all three issues and three issues identified in the diagnosis. Start and finish times followed, legitimate chain of command followed, and respectful behavior in the workplace. Number one, start and finish times followed. Clearly, the established start time was 9 a.m., and Bob was violating this boundary. The only question is whether he was within the workplace norms. If Sally was acting as the practitioner in the situation, in other words, there was no mediator or third party helping, and Sally had to assume responsibility for managing the conflict. She could intervene by re-establishing the start time boundary and the expectation with Bob that he arrived no later than 9 a.m. every day. We are talking about re-establishment, the boundaries, re-establishment, the norms. Specifically when only one single person, not a jury, not a committee, not two or three person, not with different levels of management, only one person, one single person has the authority to handle, to manage, or to resolve the conflict. Both Bob and Sally would need to be clear about the consequences for violation. And Sally, as the authority, would need to enforce the boundary if it was violated again. Because she is there for doing based on the boundaries. She is there for improving the performance of organization. She is there for improving the performance of employees. Finally ended to the improving the organization. She is not there for doing on the wheel of, for example, another one's like Bob. She has the authority for work based on the rules. In addition, Sally. So at first, we should be certain about that. Bob has understood the consequences of violation and the exact time of the starting time, exact time of entering the organization. In addition, Sally could explore with Bob the reasons Bob has been late. At first, we are talking about the consequences. The second part is talking about the roots, the causes. Okay, if you are late, you have punishment. Late work policy, for example, we use for your late work policy for the weekly assignments. Second part, we are talking about the roots and causes. Yes, if you are late, you will lose some money. If it is repeated, you will be fired. But why you are late? We are talking about the causes and roots of the problem, the conflict. Sally could explore with Bob the reasons Bob has been late and look at other solutions, such as flex time, to see if that might solve the problem for both parties. Sometimes, for example, Bob says, I have some sleeping problems and I am not so fresh. Okay, we can consider new schedule for you as a flex time, but a schedule, not at will, that every time you want to come to work, every time you don't want. It is not a schedule. But we can consider not a fixed schedule. We can consider a flex schedule or flex time to see if that might solve. The key step here, the key step here, however, would be to reestablish and clarify the boundary in response to Bob's statement that others are doing it. He is confirming the norms, not as the norms, not as a tolerable area, as the new boundaries. Sally should ensure that other team members are held equally accountable for understanding and complying with the start and finish time boundary. Sometimes one example in an organization can lead you to find the better answers. Strategic direction number two, legitimate chain of command followed. In this case, Sally has established a new boundary in requiring that Bob take direction from Diane. Bob, however, did not view Sally's judgment or decision as legitimate and therefore challenged both her jurisdiction and authority in this situation. Sally should explore Bob's reason for rejecting her jurisdiction and what he would need to willingly accept her authority. Authority and jurisdiction are about um, force, are about power, but not only about the dictation, not only about the dictatorship. I have the force, I have the position, the organizational position to make some decisions. It's okay. It's a duty, it's the responsibility of an authority, but it is not about the dictatorship. By focusing on the future, the practitioner Sally can help find a way to either reestablish acceptance of the jurisdictional authority voluntarily or mandate it through either discipline or the involvement of a higher authority. If you cannot accept my authority, you can talk to my boss. He or she will say to you that, yes, I have the authority to ask you any question in the area, for example, of organization, to the higher authority. Because at the first step, you see that Bob said, who are you? Why should I answer you? What's your position to be eligible, to be legitimate, to ask me the question about the entering, starting time, and closing time? Sally says, I'm the authority here. I'm the boss. I'm the manager, for example, for timing and scheduling and other things. If somebody like Bob says, no, I don't like to work with you, you say, oh, go up and talk with my higher authority level, for example, for the general manager, or over me, the manager over me, over my situation. And yes, either way, the model guides the practitioner to help reestablish the legitimacy of the jurisdiction and authority between the two parties. In the case of a work to rule approach, the difficulty lies in the fact that worker is technically operating within the boundary, although at its absolute minimum. Work to rule, yes. I come here and I work, I do my job at the minimum acceptable level. You cannot say me, you are not doing, you are doing something fail or something fault in the organization. I am working to rule. What rule says, what my contract says, it is not in my contract. I work to rule at the minimum acceptable level. It is acceptable. The authority cannot say you that you are not doing your responsibility, your duties. You say, yes, this is my duty, but at the minimum acceptable level. In other words, the authority is being acknowledged, but the jurisdiction is implicitly being challenged. In Bob's case, the task for Sally is to explore what Bob needs in order to fully accept the jurisdiction involved and get back to normal performance. Number three strategic direction in our case study is respectful behavior in their workplace. Most workplaces have boundaries around respectful behavior, though few are clearly articulated. Because of that, I said that sometimes it is based on your race, based on your culture, based on your society, based on your religion, sometimes. That you guess, not clarify, you guess that, yes, this behavior is respectful and that behavior is not respectful. But there is no articulation clearly, directly talking about that this is respectful, this is not respectful. Sometimes you find these problems also in organizations. The practitioner needs to help the parties explore what a reasonable boundary around respectful behavior is, how both would define it and monitor it, and help them agree to implement a new and clear boundary around this issue. To accomplish this, Sally needs to help Diane understand the company harassment policy and ensure that her behavior doesn't breach it. Sally could also speak to Bob to find out what he wanted to achieve with the harassment complaint and explore options around how else they may be able to address that. In sexual harassment or other types of harassment, and also in discrimination, in gender-based discrimination, difference between female and male at work, in culture-based discrimination, and social-based, society-based discrimination. Two things is very important. One, direct articulation, direct talking about the expected respect, not the respect. If you say, I respect you, I expect you to respect me. I said, so what does it mean respect? You say, everything in your family, everything in your culture, everybody should know about the respect. I said, sorry, it's an organization, it's not my family, it's not my culture. What are the the direct criteria for having a respectful behavior in an organization, in a culture, in a society, in a department, in a team? The first part is talking about the respectful behavior so directly, clearly. Second part, we are talking about the consequences of not having respectful, expected respectful behavior. You see in the families that in their first years, as the in premarital counseling, we talk about the cultures, and the young couples don't say that no, it is not so important. Yes, because what I am looking at in the next 3 years is not what you are looking at the first year. It is about love, about the romance, about the good sex relationship, about the hoping the future and other things. But in the perspective, I know that basic misunderstanding of cultures and sometimes inharmonized, there is no harmonization between the cultures, they will find some major problems. Sally could also speak to Bob to find out what he wanted and achieve that address. And assessment and applying the model. Diagnostically, this model is reasonably deep, meaning it can help diagnose potential causes of conflict in a variety of circumstances. That said, it also restricts its diagnosis to boundary-related issues, meaning that it is limited in its range or scope of diagnosis. So limited, only about the boundaries. That puts it model at medium at the diagnostic scale, not high level of diagnosis, high level, not lower level. It's the medium at the diagnostic scale. Strategically, it offers clear idea for intervention. Interest one, two, three, this one, that one, you should do, you should not do that, along with key goals for the intervention. Very clear. It is very, very applicable model for resolving the conflicts, for disputing the disagreements. It is very, very applicable model, very good model, very functional model. Also, you said you read at the first stage of the PowerPoint that it is based on the PhD thesis, not only from the experience, and along with key goals for intervention, both of which can guide a practitioner. It therefore rates high on the strategic scale. Rating of diagnosis is middle. Rating of diagnosis for a straight, clear, one, two, three, clear strategic plan, the strategic scale, it is high. Although the boundary model is extremely useful in a wide range of conflicts, it probably has its greatest usefulness in rational conflict. Conflict in which the parties will continue to interact after the dispute is resolved. It is, sorry, relational conflict. Relational conflict is the conflict that after conflict is resolved, you have some disputation. It is relational. It is not about the content. It is about the context of the conflict. It is about the form of the problems, not the content of the problems. If you are talking about the content of problems, this model is very, very good. An assessment of boundary issues, along with a focus on better clarity around boundary, carries an implicit assumption that future interactions are likely, a good prediction for the future. In situations where no future interactions are likely, boundary model analysis becomes more abstract and less functional or practical for the practitioner, because we are talking about creating change and change management in the relationship. And this is about the future, not the present moment. Final part is practitioners' worksheet and the workplace. Identify the issues in the conflict, and for each one, identify the boundary that is violated, circumvented, or threatened. The major principle, the major elements of conflict here, because of the boundary, which is norm, which is conflict, which is crisis, and which part is inter boundaries, inter two boundaries, and intervene based on the diagnosis. So at first you should know what is the problem. Is there any problem within the boundaries? There is no problem within the boundaries. When something or some behavior, some idea, some thought, some emotions are within the boundaries, it is okay. In this model, it is okay. But after that, a little going out, entering the normal area, it is also okay. It is not legal, but it is okay. It is tolerable. After that, going and continuing, over expanding the norms, it is you are entering the conflictual area. It is not good. It can be harmful. It can have some level of measurement of punishment or fines. And if you are going out of the conflictual state, you are going and entering the critical part. You see here, this is the worksheet in two columns. In first columns, you see conflict issues, and the second part is boundary violated. Identify the issues in the conflict, and for each one, identify the boundary that is violated, circumvented, or threatened. And the last part, you can see some of them here. Violation of boundary due to lack of clarity, of differing expectations, which is diagnosis. Your strategic intervention is clarify the boundary, discuss the expectation of all parties, clarify the consequences of boundary violation. It is very important. The major, the major, the basic, the most fundamental technique, principle in behaviorism, in behavioral modification is working with consequences of action. Something like that you read in uh, law of reciprocity or reciprocal reaction. Consequences of action is the most fundamental technique, most fundamental consequence of all human behavior modification. As you can see here, clarify the consequences of boundary violation. Look at me. This is your boundary. Here is the normal part. You can go over your boundary until the time you are in the normal area. Normal area is not legal, but it is tolerable. Perfect. And this is the within boundary. If you want to be a good, acceptable, high level citizen, you should work, you should live in the boundary, enter the boundaries. If you want to a little chaotic, a little anarchistic, okay, go to normal. But after entering the conflict area in this model also, you should know the punishment. You should know about the fines. You should know about the consequences of violation. And if you are entering the critical period, the critical time, the critical area, it is unforgivable. And many, many higher levels of punishment. It is related to the concept and to the content of the boundaries. If it is about, for example, living of other people, okay, go to jail for the rest of your life. If it is about driving, you can we can delete and cancel your driving license for 1 year. If you are entering, for example, in the critical area, you are creating some crisis, something more than conflict, something more than tolerable norms, something more than healthy interdisciplinary interboundaries area. You are going and entering some critical area. You are creating crisis. So violation of the boundary due to deliberate expansion of its norm. It's called reestablish and clarify the boundary. Lack of acceptance of jurisdiction, gain acceptance of jurisdiction, establish a legitimacy and other things, and lack of acceptance of authority. Again, gain acceptance of who has authority. Finally speaking, this is a very academic model because based on the PhD dissertation. Very academic, not mathematical, but academic model. It has an academic model. Good for action, as you see. Good for modifying action, not about the roots. Also, it talks about the roots, but not about the modification of roots. This is modification of consequences of action. I think also this model is very simple, but you can use it very, very simply in many different organizational, corporational, or even individual, interpersonal, sometimes intimate based relationships. You can find some ways of using this model in many aspects of your life. Have a good time. See you next week.